He was the nightmare that haunted Stalin's army, a ghost in white who turned the most powerful force on Earth into terrified prey. Soviet soldiers whispered his name in the dark, officers placed massive bounties on his head, and entire units refused to march where he was rumored to be waiting. They called him the White Death, and in just 100 days, this quiet Finnish farmer would kill more than 500 men, alone. The forest was frozen solid, every branch sheathed in ice so thick it swallowed sound. On the 12th day of December, 1939, a Soviet patrol trudged through that silence. 15 men wrapped in stiff wool, rifles clanking, breath turning instantly to crystals. The thermometer had collapsed past -40 degrees Celsius. Even the air felt brittle enough to shatter. They believed themselves invincible, soldiers of Stalin's Red Army, the largest force on Earth. Ahead lay a nation of farmers, loggers, and fishermen. Finland. Small, defiant, inconvenient. Moscow promised the invasion would last 10 days. Then they'd march in parades through Helsinki. But deep among the trees, something watched them. The first shot came like a sigh. No thunder, no explosion, just a dry snap that vanished into snow. The man at the rear of the patrol folded wordlessly into the drifts. The lieutenant froze mid-stride. He turned. Nothing moved. A second shot hissed through the air 3 heartbeats later. The radio man crumpled, face down, before his frozen breath reached the ground. Panic spread like fire on ice. Men dove behind snowbanks, unaware the snow offered no cover at all. More cracks followed, measured, unhurried, merciless. 12 men in less than 3 minutes. When the survivors finally crawled back to their lines hours later, half frozen and half mad, their story made no sense. They had seen no muzzle flash. Heard no enemy. The dead bore single, perfect holes through wool and bone. The Soviets gave the phantom a name whispered over campfires, Belia Smrt, the White Death. They imagined a ghost, a spirit of the cold itself. They were almost right. Because hidden beneath the frostbitten branches was no spirit, but a quiet man with farmer's hands, Simo Haiha, age 33, height barely 5'3". He had no scope on his rifle, no special uniform, no backup. What he possessed was something rarer, an understanding of the winter so complete it turned nature itself into his ally. Before the world learned his name, he would rewrite the rules of warfare with a trick so simple and so logical that entire armies would study it for decades. But in that moment, in the hush of the Karelian forest, only one fact mattered. 15 men had entered the snow. 3 had crawled back. And the White Death had just begun his hunt. Maps told a flattering lie. On paper, the Soviet Union looked like a tidal wave of men and machinery rolling toward a sliver of land on the Baltic. 1 million troops, thousands of tanks, swarms of aircraft. Finland, by contrast, could scrape together a few 100,000 fighters, many of them reservists who milked cows or felled spruce the week before the guns opened. If you added columns and compared totals, the war should have been over before the ink dried. But the land would not cooperate with arithmetic. 70% of Finland was forest, not a tidy park, but knotted, uneven, and interrupted by lakes that froze into glass in winter. The cold erased engines, cracked steel, and punished anyone who paused. Grease congealed. Boots went rigid. Breath drifted like smoke and betrayed positions. In such weather, a match struck at dusk could mean a grave by dawn. The Soviet doctrine assumed movement in broad strokes, deep formations punching ahead, armor and artillery flattening resistance. Those formations funneled onto narrow roads that twisted through trees, creating long, vulnerable snakes of men and vehicles. The Finns had a name for what they did next, mati, like chopping a log into stove-sized pieces. Slice a column, isolate a section, starve it, freeze it, finish it. Ski troops in white smocks ghosted across drifts, struck field kitchens and command posts, and bled back into the timber. Tanks that tried to leave the roads bogged or wandered onto ice, where well-placed shells turned lakes into traps. Inside this setting, not beyond it, but because of it, a single quiet man found his purpose. Simo Haiha had grown up near the border, a farm boy accustomed to the kind of winter that teaches you to be exact. He competed in local shooting matches not for spectacle but because a good shot makes chores easier and meat more certain. He preferred simple things that worked every time. When the call came, he joined the 34th Infantry Regiment. No one would have picked him out of a line for height or swagger. He carried himself like someone who knew that in January the forest listens to you more than you command it. The rifle he drew from the armory was a Finnish M/28-30, sturdy, accurate, almost stubborn in its reliability. It came with iron sights. An officer offered him an upgrade, a magnified optic, the new way of war. Many snipers swore by scopes. They brought the far close. Targets seemed larger, chances clearer. Simo shook his head. He did not dislike technology. He disliked the weaknesses that came with it in this particular place, during this particular winter. He had 3 reasons, and each belonged to the cold. First, glass catches light. A lens at the edge of a tree line can wink even under a weak sun, and a wink is the loudest thing in a silent forest. Second, glass fogs. A warm face pressed to a cold scope paints the lens in milk. By the time the haze clears, the moment is gone or the enemy has found you. Third, posture. To see through an optic, you must lift your head higher than a man using iron sights. In a white field where every dark bump begs for a bullet, 2 inches is the difference between a hunter and a casualty. So he kept the irons and trained his eye to the ranges he knew he could command, from the length of 2 football fields to 4, where heartbeat and breath matter more than magnification. Then came the refinements, each uncomplicated, each aimed at erasing the signs that a human hand had fired a shot. Counter-snipers watched for the puff, that burst of powdery snow kicked up by the muzzle. Simo answered by turning his firing lane into ice. He packed the snow in front of his barrel, poured water on it, and let it seize. When he fired, there was no telltale plume. Just snow being snow, unmoved by violence. The cold made breath a traitor. In these temperatures, exhalation trails hang like banners. Simo neutralized the flag where it began. He held packed snow in his mouth to cool the air before he released it. What left his lips was already near the outside temperature. No ghosts of steam. No drifting warnings. He burrowed low, sometimes into the side of a drift, clothing blending with the landscape. He learned to wait without twitching. Shivering rattles a rifle. Time and discipline smothered that urge. He treated waiting as a craft, settle the body, slow the heart, let the cold become background noise rather than an alarm. People later called these tricks ingenious, as if he pulled them from a magician's hat. He would have called them obvious. Remove the glint. Remove the fog. Remove the tell. Make the winter your uniform and your silencer. While he honed such details, the scale of the wider fight pressed inward. The Soviets pushed divisions toward the Karelian Isthmus and along forest roads in the east, confident that numbers could smother any resistance. They found instead that fires invited bullets, tight ranks invited grenades, and speed died in the drifts. Reports piled up not just of casualties, but of paralysis. Patrols unwilling to move, officers hesitant to stand. The forest seemed to devour confidence. To explain that feeling, soldiers invented a figure because figures are easier to fear than weather, a pale hunter who saw without being seen. They traded rumors about scopes shot through and men plucked from the edge of light. There were other Finnish marksmen at work, competent and brave, but the tales collected around one name the way hoarfrost coats a twig, Haiha. Back at his line, Simo avoided talk. He checked his sights, wiped frost from metal, and counted biscuits. He learned the rhythms of the opposing army, when the kitchen smoke rose, when runners left a headquarters dugout, when replacements arrived, new uniforms stiff and unsure. He did not look for heroics. He looked for patterns. The great advantage of the forest is that it repeats itself if you are patient. Paths reappear. Habits repeat. Mistakes too. A typical morning began well before the sky admitted it was morning. He ate something small and sweet, pulled on layers of white, lashed his submachine gun to his back, and slid into the trees on skis. He moved at a pace that would frustrate an impatient man and calm a careful one. He did not aim to be first to the fight. He wanted to be there before the other side remembered that the day demanded choices. He often set 2 or 3 positions the day prior, a nest here with a hardened firing lane, another 40 or 50 paces away, and a third covering a different angle. Shoot. Move. Settle. Shoot. The goal was to ensure that any response arrived where he had been, not where he was. These habits made him tireless rather than quick, inevitable rather than loud. Behind the numbers and the tactics stood something the Finns named in their own language, sisu, a blend of grit, stubbornness, and composure when ease has long since fled. Simo wore that word like another layer against the wind. His choices weren't dramatic. They were deliberate, repeated, and devastating. The officers who watched the front tried to square hearsay with their manuals. Snipers were supposed to wait half a day for a single shot, then knelt back before anyone could fix their location. Yet reports came in of multiple hits in one morning, then more in the afternoon, spaced just so, each placed with a carpenter's calm. Doubt gave way to reluctant belief when observers took a turn beside him and returned stunned at how ordinary the work looked up close. Gather the snow, chew the snow, level the rifle on a wedge of ice, breathe cool, and let the trigger move like a door on oiled hinges. The war of columns and treaties continued to grind along the map edges. New offensives planned, new units fed into the trees. But in the spaces between those arrows, Simo began to carve out a zone where movement slowed and decisions faltered. A road that seemed safe at noon felt haunted by dusk. Patrols took the long way, then stopped taking any way at all. Soon, numbers would replace rumors, and dates would anchor the legend. But before tallies and promotions and the day bullets found him, there was this. A farmer who brought farm logic to a killing season, stripped of ornament, attentive to the plain facts of winter. And the winter was on his side. Dawn in that theater arrived like a rumor, the sky silvered, the pines quit creaking, and frost lifted from bark in whispering flakes. Simo Haiho was usually in position before then, pressed so low that the snow skimmed his cheek, rifle eased onto its icy cradle. He did not think in poems or slogans. He thought in distances, wind, and habit. Targets were not trophies. They were interruptions to a plan. A runner tracing a line between 2 dugouts. A sergeant stopping to gesture, elbow high and exposed. A machine gun crew turning their attention outward instead of downward, intent on belt and feed cover. Simo learned the tempo of those moments until the music almost played itself. If he fired, it was because the pattern had crescendoed to a note he recognized. He spoke rarely about numbers. Others did the counting for him. On some days the tally he gave his lieutenant sounded like mischief, as if a small man with a quiet mouth were teasing larger men with outlandish claims. 5 before breakfast. 8 by mid-afternoon. 12 on a short day. They sent an observer to watch, certain there would be a trick behind the trick. The observer returned mute at first, then oddly reverent, as if he had attended a service. What he saw was not a conjuring act, but an economy. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed, and nothing done twice the same way. Wherever the line stabilized, stories began to pool. They were not about the whole Finnish front, which kept fighting, bleeding, and freezing in the way that armies always have. They were about slivers of forest where motion cost too much courage. Coal scuttle fires that once meant comfort now meant a coin toss. The man nearest the warmth could be the man with the sudden hole, body rocking back as if tugged by a string. At ranges that made other shooters squint, Simo's iron sight picture was steady enough to thread shots through brush gaps he had measured the day before with nothing more than his eye and a patience sharpened by years of still hunting. The men across the trees learned to fear quiet. In other wars, silence promised rest. Here, silence felt like a held breath. Sleep devolved into jittery dozes, boots still on, because standing brought a sense of being visible and lying down reminded them of those first patrols, the ones that had bled into the drifts with no warning. Letters intercepted later spoke in a plain, aching register, "We are not fighting an army in this place. We are fighting the waiting." That line, devoid of metaphor, said more than any legend. The Soviet command could not afford to grant mythology that kind of room. They tried precision first. Counter-sniper teams, fresh from schools where the doctrine was clean, moved in with scopes that gleamed even when their owners shaded the glass with mittened hands. They were trained to look for the puff of disturbed snow, to triangulate from sound, to haunt tree lines and wait for an impatient breath. Simo's measures turned each of those instincts against them. The ice-masked muzzle produced no plume. Chewed snow made exhale disappear. And because his head stayed low, their glass caught light before his iron ever found their brow. Once, twice, perhaps more, students of rifles peered at the world through their optics, and saw the last image they would ever register, a dark notch and post a line precisely where an eye fills a circle. When that didn't work, the guns moved in. Mortars walked barrages across grid squares. Heavy shells resculpted familiar stands of spruce into jagged bowls. In the middle of that recitation of thunder, Simo's task got paradoxically simpler. The barrage swallowed the small sounds that give a sniper away, the tiny metallic breath of a bolt running home, the creak of a sling, the granular crunch of weight shifting on packed crystals. He flowed between craters, settled where shock loosened snow enough to lie deeper, and used chaos as cover. If he emerged with cuts and bruises, he shrugged and reset. The forest accepted him back in the way cold landscapes accept anyone who truly understands them, without ceremony, without complaint. By late December, dates acquired a charge. One day saw more than 24 hits. Another approached that again. A holiday passed, and while men in rear echelons found solace in cups and songs, the edge of the front endured its own observance. The ritual of the one shot that ends a threat, then the quiet glide away to the next prepared shelf of ice. The work no longer felt like an anomaly stitched into the war. It began to shape it. Patrols were cancelled or assigned in pairs that moved like quarrelsome planets, never too near, never entirely alone, both postures inefficient and yet preferable to walking exactly as the day before. Leadership meetings shortened. A hand raised to point drew glances. Field kitchens were shifted farther back, and stomachs roiled over cooling meals eaten in holes. So they escalated again. A special detail formed, not a lone counterpart, but a small platoon with instructions that fit on a matchbox. Locate the White Death and erase him. They rehearsed their advance under officers who insisted on low profiles and coordination by touch when voice might travel. They came at first light, believing surprise to be an ally. Simo had seen the staging the day before, thin threads moving in the timber where threads should not. He had set positions not just to shoot but to rotate, a hinge here, a fulcrum there. When the lead elements passed his first nest, he let them go. He cut the radio line in the last man and slipped off the track so that when confusion came, it would arrive without instructions. The initial shot clipped command. The next came from a different quarter entirely. Men turned toward one sound and found another. When a half-dozen bunched to build a small fire against the killing cold despite discipline, he switched tools. The submachine gun spoke in a harsh, stuttering tongue that made everyone else think there he is, and by the time they focused, he was already elsewhere, lying behind a dent in the drift and lowering his breathing back to a pattern a metronome would envy. The survivors fled not in order but in panicked arcs, and another patrol later, Finnish soldiers followed boot tracks into darkness and counted bodies crumpled alone and in pairs, each curve of the trail a little narrative of dread. One could argue that none of this was personal courage, but merely craft applied without flinch. That is too sterile. It takes a particular stubbornness to make a body obey the stillness a shot demands when the mercury has fled the glass and the forest tries to leach heat through every seam. It takes will to say no to an easier sight picture because you've noticed what a lens does in low sun. And it takes a farmer's stubborn practicality to do the same small, unglamorous tasks. Pack, pour, freeze, settle, chew, every dawn, every midday, every fading light, when the hands would rather live in mittens and the jaw would rather unclench. His legend grew not because he sought it, but because fear needs a face. Fear will sculpt one if you deny it details. The Red Army's reports began to feel like weather bulletins. Storms in these sectors. Avoid these roads after dark. Expect losses if you linger by warmth. Meanwhile, Simo measured a day's work not in astonishment but in the absence of errors. A missed shot was a bruise he massaged for days as he studied what had shifted, wind in the notch of 2 trees, or haste, that impatient thief. By early March, the ledger of his confirmed kills had climbed beyond numbers reasonable people attached to a single human being. Others, struck down by his submachine gun when situations demanded something less surgical, were counted separately or not at all. He was promoted, recognition folding over him like another layer of cloth. The ceremonies meant little. He returned to his routine the next day, as if ranks and medals exchanged no heat with the air. War, jealous of any figure who distorts its grind, has a way of hunting back. The more Simo denied the enemy their planes and plans, the more artillery and scouts his slice of forest attracted. Positions that had once been quiet for hours felt watched. Mortars tuned their arcs to the rhythm of his sector, and the ground shivered more often with heavy arrivals. The day the bullet found him did not announce itself as special. It began with the same measured tasks and the same measured cold. If a calendar later assigned it significance, that was history retrofitting meaning onto weather and metal. Somewhere between 2 shots well placed, a third voice entered, the strange, brutal report of an explosive round. And then, in an instant that would fracture bone and legend, sight and sound broke apart. The shot did not roar. It struck like a door slamming somewhere deep inside the skull. For Simo Häyhä, there was no pain at first, only the sharp awareness that the world had shifted sideways. He tried to draw a breath, and the air filled with a taste like copper and fire. The snow beneath his cheek turned red, steaming briefly before freezing again. An explosive bullet had found him, fired from 300 meters away, the one perfect blind throw in a season full of misses. The men nearby saw him collapse and thought the legend was over. One moment the White Death had been adjusting his aim, the next, half his face was gone. They dragged what was left of him from the front and laid him with the others, motionless, the left side of his jaw shattered into ruin. No one expected movement. For the first time in 100 days, the forest seemed empty of his presence. But legends dislike endings written by strangers. Hours later, a medic passing the heap of bodies noticed a tremor in one leg, a twitch, faint but deliberate. Simo Häyhä was still alive. He was taken first to a field dressing station, then to a hospital farther from the guns. By the time surgeons reached him, the swelling had turned his head into a grotesque mask. They could do little more than clean the wound and wait. For a week he hovered between worlds, silent, unconscious, a ghost even to himself. When he woke, he couldn't speak. The inside of his mouth was a ruin, the lower jaw shattered, cheek torn away. But he could hear the snow outside, the slow drip of meltwater, the quiet that had always been his ally. He learned through nods that the war was ending. The winter war had lasted 105 days, longer than anyone on either side expected. Finland had signed a peace treaty. Its soldiers had withdrawn from territories they'd fought for with impossible stubbornness. The Red Army entered empty ground, victorious on paper but humiliated in practice. For the Soviet Union, the cost was staggering. Over 1 million casualties, thousands of tanks and aircraft lost, and an army's reputation shattered. Their soldiers rode home about nightmares, about forests that whispered and rifles that spoke once and never again. Even after the fighting stopped, units refused to patrol certain sectors. Those places carried a name, the Ghost's Ground. Simo's own battle continued in silence. He endured surgery after surgery, bones grafted from hip to jaw, flesh from thigh to cheek. 26 operations in all, each one a negotiation between pain and endurance. He never complained. When nurses asked if he wanted morphine, he simply blinked once, slowly, as if conserving motion for the rest of his life. Outside, the world rearranged itself. Stalin's generals rewrote reports. They buried the numbers under slogans and medals, pretending that Finland had been a mere inconvenience. But in Berlin, another man watched the failure with predatory interest. Adolf Hitler studied the reports from the north and saw weakness. He saw an army crippled by cold and fear, a giant made brittle by arrogance. The myth of invincibility was gone, stripped away not by another empire, but by one small nation and a farmer who understood snow better than steel. 1 year later, Hitler would gamble everything on that assumption. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was born partly from the humiliation at the Finnish front. Had the Red Army not looked so breakable, perhaps he would have hesitated. And in that sense, the ripples from one man's frozen rifle reached all the way to Moscow's gates. In the hospital, time slowed. Simo's face healed into a map of scars, uneven and strange. When he caught his reflection months later, he studied it without vanity or horror, merely curiosity. He had faced worse sights through his sights. The doctors called him miraculous. He called it luck and let the word fall flat from the corner of his half-mouth. By the summer of 1940, he was able to walk outside again. The forest had thawed into rivers, the snowfields turned to lakes of light. He smelled pine, damp earth, the ordinary perfume of survival. Somewhere distant, artillery rumbled in exercises for the next war that everyone knew was coming. He listened, then smiled faintly with the good side of his face. It sounded far away, and that was enough. The White Death had not died. He had simply gone quiet, again. But the silence this time belonged to peace, not terror. The war receded like a blizzard seen in a rearview mirror, still enormous, still dangerous, but no longer closing the distance. Simo Häyhä stepped back into ordinary life with the same calm he carried into the drift each dawn. He could not hide the scars. They spoke first in every room. Yet the way he wore them made them quieter, as if the wound had been tamed by the man who carried it. He was offered speeches and ceremonies. He accepted the promotions because they were official business, not because he needed brass to know what he had done. Medals went into a drawer. Newspapers asked for quotes. He spared them syllables. Where a lesser celebrity might have rattled on, Simo preferred nouns and verbs that fit into a single breath. A reporter once asked him how he became so effective. He answered with one word that doubled as a creed: practice. And that was that. He did not return to his childhood farmhouse. The maps had shifted. A new property waited in another town, a tidy plot with fields that answered to work. Simo planted, repaired, sharpened. He raised dogs that loved the woods as much as he did. When autumn came, he hunted elk with a competence that made other marksmen rethink their pride. He moved like a man who trusted the ground. His face, stern on one side and sunken on the other, looked carved rather than disfigured, an emblem of weather more than of violence. Visitors arrived from time to time, soldiers who had served near him, boys who wanted a handshake from a legend, journalists who wanted to distill courage into a headline. They met a small man who poured coffee, who asked after their families, who put more wood on the fire when the room felt cold. If they pressed for stories of the front, he gave them facts without adjectives. He did not savor the telling. Killing, in his view, never grew larger from being described. It simply became heavier. The years wound forward and the world convulsed again. Finland fought a second time. Simo asked to return to service, and the army, after glancing at the reconstructed jaw and the long ledger of operations that had remade his face, declined. The verdict could have soured a different personality. For him, it was one more fact. He went home and sharpened an axe. He was not a hermit. He attended community gatherings. He traded stories about weather and dogs. He smiled easily, even if the smile tugged crooked. People who expected a scowl met kindness. People who expected a sermon met silence. Simo's philosophy was simple enough to be mistaken for stubbornness. Do the task in front of you, do it cleanly, then do the next one. On a farm, that is how buildings stand and animals thrive. In a war, it is how men survive. When younger hunters asked for advice, he taught them fundamentals with a clockmaker's patience. How to settle the body so the rifle did not fight the heartbeat. How to feel wind without looking at trees. How to decide not to shoot when the shot was wrong. He showed them the discipline of low posture, the courtesy of cleaning a tool before praise, the quiet checklists that keep mistakes small. They came for lore and left with chores. Many of them improved. Age, that gentle and relentless enemy, took his speed before it took his strength. He accepted both losses. He gave up the heaviest chores first, and let the younger hands lift, while he instructed. The scarred half of his face stiffened in winter, and he learned to wrap a scarf just so, not to hide but to stay warm. He walked more slowly through the woods but noticed more as he did. Fresh sign, a branch bent by last night's wind, a print where a fox had paused to listen. As decades passed, the legend that once frightened enemies became a story told for instruction. In classrooms and barracks, instructors used his name to teach fundamentals. Camouflage is not a pattern but a behavior. Equipment is only as good as the logic that uses it. The environment is not a backdrop but a partner. His tricks were presented as revelations, but anyone who listened to Simo long enough heard something plainer. Remove the obvious errors and you remove most of the danger. No glint. No fog. No plume. Build from subtraction. Strangers sometimes wanted absolution from him. They asked whether he regretted the count attached to his name. He did not recite justifications. He offered the same sentence, unadorned. I did what I was asked to do, and I did it as well as I could. It sounded like paperwork, but it carried the weight of a man who had organized chaos into a craft, and then put the craft away when the job was finished. If there was a secret left unexplained, it lived not in his rifle but in his patience. To wait well is to respect time, and Simo respected it absolutely. He could split a task into hours without hating the hours. He could sit with discomfort without turning it into drama. He could let silence be a friend rather than a threat. Those abilities look like temperament, but they are more often habits shaped by long winters and chores that do not forgive haste. He grew old in a country that had learned painfully the price of staying independent. Farm roads turned to asphalt. The radio on his kitchen shelf traded ballads for news, then for talk shows filled with people who loved the sound of their own urgency. Simo turned the volume down and saved his hearing for the outdoors. When the snow returned each year, he walked to the fence line and watched the field become what it always had been in his mind, a page the wind could write on. In the late 1990s, curiosity surged again. A new generation discovered his story and sent letters, cameras, microphones. He remained courteous. He answered questions that respected the work and sidestepped those that wanted spectacle. The one detail he never surrendered was vanity. He refused to make himself larger in the retelling. If anyone inflated the legend, it would not be him. He lived to 96. When the end approached, it did so the way dawn had in the Karelian woods, quietly, with a shift in the light and a softening of the air. At his funeral, there were uniforms and flags, but there were also farmers with rough hands, hunters with careful eyes, and neighbors who remembered a man who loaned tools and returned them cleaner than he received them. They buried him in Ruokolahti, the earth folded back over the ground he had loved, an ordinary plot for a life that had defied math. What remains of Simo Häyhä is not merely a ledger of confirmed hits. Ledgers are for clerks. What remains is a method and a posture toward the world. Know your environment until it knows you back. Choose simple tools you can trust in the worst weather. Remove the signals that betray you. Practice until you can do the right thing even when the body protests. Let results speak louder than explanation. His story is often summarized as one farmer who stopped an army. That flatters the man and shortchanges the truth. He did not stop an army. He slowed it where it mattered, turned silence into pressure, and proved that mastery born of humility can bend the course of giants. He made the cold an accomplice. He made patience a weapon. He made invisibility a craft. If you listen closely, you can still hear what frightened the soldiers who marched into those forests so long ago. It was not the gunshot. It was the pause afterward, the way the sound vanished into snow and never returned, as if the winter itself had spoken and then closed its mouth. That pause is the measure of his life. Work finished. Breath steady. Silence restored. And somewhere beyond the tree line, a small man in white gets to his feet, brushes frost from his sleeve, and walks home.